Jamie always is nice to me.
Well, this is with the applicants, so
And I think I'd be damaged.
I don't know what happened, but something happened.
All right, so level up before I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Can people
Oh, we did.
on
I
Zoom
don't
hear
know.
us?
I'm talking about phone calls. I've got.
Oh, I don't.
People on Zoom not hear us.
Doesn't look like we need to ground.
Right.
We know,
Where are my speakers? now?
but we don't. I see them up there, but I don't
Not
hear anything.
Those speakers should be on.
Do you have one near you? Yeah, that's.
Well, those pick up from anywhere. Right?
How the speaker bar off, separate.
It should be a little with the cameras.
Dan, are you able to hear us?
Dale Peterson.
Yes.
Oh, okay, good.
She's,
It is Dale Peterson. Do you know Dale?
From 100 years ago in the city.
He's working with us in Copic on the zoning revision. We're actually having a great time.
Okay, I think similar to last month, and pretty much any time that we have a guest speaker, I should have done this before I sent this around, but we're going to elevate number 3 to number 1 on the agenda. Nan Stolzenberg is here today to talk to us about quite a few things. Nan has helped with comp plan amendments throughout the county and really throughout the region. I think that's fair to say, Nan, probably extra regional as well. Nan's got a presentation today about connecting towns to the tools that she's developed for a few of the towns a little bit south of us, as well as considerations that towns should take into account when they're updating their comp plans when it comes to affordable housing, which I know lines up with things that Copic is working on, things like Ghent is working on, New Lebanon. So I think that this has a lot of relevance to quite a few of our towns. And that, I think, is enough for me. Nan, feel free to
Great.
take it away.
Great.
Okay.
Chris, could you put this on record so that we can have Nan's presentation for posterity?
These are all recorded for posterity.
They are recorded?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
recorded.
Okay, good.
Out on the world. Where are we?
All right, shall I launch in?
Yeah, let me just make sure I can have the ability to share.
Okay, let me,
Excellent.
And it was good.
all right, you all get that?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So yeah, I know that we have somewhat limited time, so thanks for inviting me to join you all. And I'm going to jump right in and talk about housing initiatives and zoning and how we can connect the dots between that. And let me just, whoops. My mouse is a little sensitive today. So anyway, so I wanted to start with where all planning starts when it comes to zoning, and that's the comprehensive plan. And the comprehensive plan is a really critical tool. It's both legally important because all of our towns' land use regulations need to be consistent with the comprehensive plan. A comprehensive plan is really important to engage the community and find out what's important, what are the issues facing the community, understanding current conditions. And when that especially refers to housing, we need to understand what type of housing a community has and where, vacancy rate, cost, affordability ratios. We usually calculate all those kinds of things to get a picture for what kind of housing is available and what the needs and desires in the community are. But beyond that, the comprehensive plan also is super important to establish a direction for the future. The purpose statements that we all have in our zoning laws are direct connections between what the zoning is supposed to accomplish and what the community has stated as its policy for moving forward. So the comprehensive plan is really the place to start to identify your needs and establish the direction. The comprehensive plan, the meat of it, so to speak, is really the strategies and actions, and that lays down the specific programs, policies, and capital improvements and regulatory changes that the community wants to make to meet its vision and goals. I just added in that these days, I mean, certainly for the last few years, the Comprehensive plan also is critical for grant writing success. When it comes to any of the state CFA grant programs, having a direct connection that outlines what you're trying to accomplish, that it was part of a community effort to identify that and where you want to go with it is really critical to any kind of grant writing. So I think it's really important for you all when you're thinking of affordable housing from the kind of the municipal toolbox, is to really understand where your comprehensive plan is at. If it's more than 5 or 6 years old, it needs to have crack the cover open and take a look at it and see what it says. And you don't have to do a wholesale rewrite of it, but it's really important to revalidate the vision and the goals and to find out what the issues facing the community are and make sure that plan is kept up to date. And the zoning then flows from all of that work. So we always start with the comprehensive plan. And then some of the specific things that you should be looking at related to housing in your comprehensive plan, certainly in all of your aspects of public engagement, your survey questions, any focus groups that you have, or any open houses, and whatever the public engagement is that you're doing in your community should address housing, should ask questions about housing, what people think about the current conditions, what their issues are, what they hope for, what kind of housing they're looking for. All of those are fair questions to explore in the community engagement part of the comprehensive plan project. As I said in the first slide, mapping and learning about housing conditions. You have quite a bit of data in Columbia County that a lot of other counties don't have. So you're ahead of the game in that respect. So you can certainly pull from the studies that have been done on housing in the community. But at the town level and the village level, we really need to understand what's going on, what you have available, where there are gaps, and what are the needs, so you can start figuring out ways to fill that. Most comprehensive plans have what's called a SWOT. It stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. I think it's just a way to organize all the information you've learned in the process, to help you understand what the needs and the challenge and the opportunities are. So I think that's just a kind of standard tool to include in your comprehensive plan. The goals and objectives from a housing perspective, I would hope that you would have a goal, that there would be something in your vision statement about housing, and diverse and equitable, affordable, accessible housing. Having a goal that addresses that and sets the direction that it's an important thing for the community to accomplish. And then, of course, the kind of the meat of the comprehensive plan are those strategies and actions. And typically those get into, and we're not writing the specific zoning language in a comprehensive plan, but we're setting direction and we're setting policy and we're setting the instructions so that when the comprehensive plan is adopted, those who are going to be working on the zoning law know what to do. And the time to have community discussions about housing, in my opinion, is during the comprehensive plan process, not during the zoning update process. The zoning update process should be to implement already accepted policy for the community. And that would be the types of housing you want, where those types of housings are appropriate to go, where the infrastructure is appropriate to handle certain kinds of density or certain types of housing, whether you're going to have incentives or mandates for certain kinds of housing, and the review process. Those can all be outlined in the comprehensive plan strategies. And I think they're all really important pieces to lay the foundation for successful implementation through a regulatory program. The housing toolbox is large. It's not just land use regulations, as I'm sure you've been talking in your committee. Chris and I talked about the larger efforts to identify the toolbox. So we have certainly the regulatory tools, which are mostly zoning, site plan review, and those types of regulations. We have a variety of incentive tools that can be regulatory, but they can also be funding incentives as well. Partnerships is a critical piece. Housing can't be done alone by any one community. It's got to be a group and collaborative effort, in my opinion, and we all have to work together to create partnerships between municipalities and organizations and agencies that are experts at housing, and the developers are a very important partner in the whole housing thing. We need to know what they're looking for and what can be a barrier and an opportunity for them to come into our communities. Education is super important. We have a real barrier in a lot of places, as I'm sure you've discussed. You know, the term affordable housing sets a lot of people on edge, and they get upset, and they conjure up an idea of, you know, like inner city kind of brick 10-story high, nameless looking buildings. And that is really not at all what we're looking for. So we really need to help the community understand what the need is, what the options and the opportunities are, so that everyone can be informed about what we can do to address housing in the community. And then there's land tools, and that's basically identifying and or acquiring locations that would be appropriate for certain kinds of affordable housing. Some of the things that we're looking at are, we've seen them all, senior housing developments or RUPCO kind of housing developments. But we're also talking about townhomes, two double family homes, missing middle kind of homes, which might be 3- and 4-plex units. So there's a variety of types of housing that in our comprehensive plan, we can identify appropriate locations for those different styles of housing. So doing all of this work in the planning phase will make implementation through the zoning a lot easier. But the rest of the time that we have together, I just really wanted to focus on some of those regulatory tools. The reason that zoning is often the first thing, in my opinion, the first thing that communities often launch into is because the community has direct control over its own zoning. Whereas lots of the other tools are more complex and they often take time and more funding. And so zoning is, I don't want to say easy, but it's the easier place to at least create an opportunity for addressing the housing issues in the community. The zoning can remove barriers. It can establish opportunities and encourage or require certain kinds of housing to address the issues. But unless someone is willing and interested in building, developing, subdividing, or doing something, it's still just a piece of paper. So the zoning is not the be all and the end all. And it is just one tool in the toolbox that needs to work in concert with all of those other tools. And I think too that we often think of zoning as, you know, it's set in stone, and once we do zoning, it's going to be that way for 30 years. And I don't believe that, and I don't think that is the right way of looking at it. I think both the comprehensive plan and the regulations that come from that plan should be responsive to the community needs. And so it should be looked at every few years, updated where it needs to. If something is not working, when we, know that the planning board is like, well, gee, we don't know what that term means. We don't know how to apply this certain regulation or development standard. That tells us we have some work to do on the zoning and we can make it better. So I think the zoning is a good tool and often in easier direction for municipalities to start addressing affordable housing. So there are, in our regulatory toolbox, there are also lots of tools that communities can work towards, and many of these work very well in our small and rural communities. And these range from making sure we have a development process that works, that doesn't tie up a development for years on end, that we're not necessarily looking to fast track and ignore a good comprehensive review process, but we're looking to lay out the rules so that someone who wants to do a project that's allowed by the zoning gets an efficient yes at the end. We need to have some assurance that if they follow the rules and the rules are clearly laid out, they'll get a yes at the end. And that's what we're hoped for, and at least what I encourage the folks I work with to work towards their zoning. Accessory dwelling units is kind of the buzzword. Everybody's talking about accessory dwelling units and the need to allow them. These are like granny flats, apartments in garages, the back room turned into an apartment. And they can have a really important role in providing affordable housing opportunities. And I probably should have put the short-term rental regulation up next to the accessory dwelling units, because these kind of have to be thought together. A lot of places, accessory dwelling units are built and simply used for short-term rentals instead of long-term affordable rentals. So those regulations really need to kind of go hand in hand. Inclusionary zoning is where we have a regulation in our zoning that requires a certain amount of dwelling units to be built that would be dedicated to be affordable units. So if you have a major subdivision that's got 20 units going in, that like a 10% or some percentage of those units must be affordable. You can offer incentives to, if you don't require these kinds of things, you can offer incentives to promote them. And that would be things like a density bonus. So it's the zoning would say, if you provide 10% of your units to be dedicated affordable units, we'll give you a density bonus. So you can put a unit or more, 1 or 2 or whatever percentage it is more. So there's an economic advantage to the developer or the landowner to actually provide those affordable units. Allowing for an increase in density, certainly in our rural areas where we have villages that have water and sewer, or hamlets that have an opportunity for that kind of infrastructure. Not every place is appropriate for that kind of infrastructure, and I certainly don't advocate it to be spread out across the whole country, but there are certainly locations that are better for that than others that could be good places for looking at certain kinds of affordable housing. Zoning can address a range of affordable housing types. As I said, everything from 2-family units to 3- and 4-plex homes. We're working in Woodstock right now where they've created a whole review process, an abbreviated site plan review process for 3- and 4-plex homes that have to be designed to be single family like, so that they're really just look and act like a large single family home. So there's all sorts of things that we need to address in terms of what's allowed as of right, what needs a review, what could use an expedited review, what needs a full-fledged special use permit. Those kinds of things really make a big difference in addressing whatever the housing needs are in the community. I mentioned short-term rental regulations are just part of the mix right now of needing to address how to handle that. There's a balance between the economic benefits of having short-term rentals and the impacts that they are having all over on affordable housing. and the as of right housing. Right now, most of our communities only have single family houses as of right, meaning you just go get a building permit. You don't have to go to the planning board. And some communities have 2-family houses as of right. But I urge everybody to start thinking about, why is that? What is it that prevents like a 3-plex or a 4-plex building to be built as of right, with certain development standards that have to be met? But I think we have to start thinking about some of these other housing types. And again, the scale, the intensity, and location make all the difference in the world as to whether they should and could be as of right. So to end, I know this is like a really compressed discussion. We could spend all day on each of these topics, but a few steps for municipalities to take would be to really look at your housing needs, look at the data that's already available, update it, or get some local data collected to give you a clue as to what your housing situation is. To complete an audit of your zoning and your land use regulations, and that's with looking at housing, a diversity of housing that's safe and accessible and that fits into the character of the community. How does your zoning and your subdivision law stack up? Can it meet those goals? Is it consistent with those goals? Does it place barriers to meeting that goal? Those can all be articulated in the comprehensive planning process. Update your comprehensive plan where needed, and make sure it establishes a policy direction and offers information as to the kinds of tools the community would need and accept to address housing. And then flowing from that comprehensive plan is the task to update the zoning and the subdivision to incorporate those regulatory tools. So there's some starting points that every community can start working on. I think that even if you, and I know that some communities are working on their comprehensive plan right now in Columbia County. Some of them have done them, many years ago, but there's conditions change rapidly. And, 8 years ago or 10 years ago, many of the things we deal with now weren't even on the horizon. So it's really important to keep your plan up to date, understand what the needs in the community are. Once you understand those needs, it's easier to figure out what the zoning should be to at least attempt to create the opportunities to address some of those problems. So with that, I used up my more than 20 minutes, I think. But I don't know, Chris, if anyone had any questions or if you just wanted to move on to the rest of your meeting.
I can practically guarantee you that there will be questions. So if anybody wants to, I have some. So if anybody wants to volunteer theirs first, I can hold off.
Sure, I'll start. Nan, it's Dan Barafaldi from Ghent. You talked a little bit about accessible housing. Can you just help us understand what you mean by that?
Well, accessibility is multifaceted. I guess when I use that term, I mean that it's both affordable, which is related to accessibility, but it's also in a location, like for instance, a senior housing development on a steep slope with no sidewalks and no bus service or no cars would not be particularly accessible. And so we want to make sure that the kinds of housing we're promoting in our zoning are in locations that serve the community that we're trying to, address, to meet. So that's what I mean by accessibility: safe, accessible, from an affordability and an actual physical access, accessible to all different kinds of folks and abilities, so that they're accessible from a physical perspective, you know, that we have ADA sidewalks and parking areas and things like that.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's Chris. I have a question. When you mentioned the collaboration between towns, which we've talked about this, and we've talked about this quite a bit in the committee, and I think it's vital. We have the Road Jam Committee, which is 3 towns in Columbia County. Can you speak a little bit about your experience with that tri-town group, or really any other situation where you collaborated with a few different towns that were trying to address specifically housing needs, or more generally planning and zoning needs?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to the planning and the zoning, that is probably the one area that the municipality, a single municipality, can work on their own, because we all have our own zoning laws and land use regulations. But we really should be looking broader. I mean, that housing toolbox, many of those things are really beyond the capacity of a small rural town to handle on their own. From funding to reaching out to developers to accessing land in the right place or identifying land in the right place. So there needs to be a broader collaboration. I know in the Tri-Town group in Dutchess County, they have a really nice view of collaborating to learn about the housing issues, learn together about the options. You know, when you have a village and a town, those are interrelated. So like the village of Kinderhook and the town of Kinderhook, we're not islands in of ourselves, and the interaction between them in terms of the zoning needs to be at least looked at and coordinated. So I think that there's even a lot of comprehensive plans tend to look very locally at just that one municipality, but some of our issues are bigger than a municipality can address on their own. So I think it's really important to, from a comprehensive planning perspective, I usually look at the zoning of what are the communities around that community doing, and are they doing something that totally is going to undo what the next community is going to do. So we really need to pay attention to what everybody's trying to move towards.
Yeah. Nan, Meredith Payne from Copake. You mentioned, all of these tools being basically part of a whole comprehensive suite of tools that you need really to create affordable housing. So zoning is in the hands of the municipality. When it comes to tax assessment policy, that's another thing that we've been thinking about. If somebody builds an ADU, do you have to increase their assessed value because they built an ADU? If somebody does housing that is restricted income levels, does that have to be assessed, kind of comparably with other housing that doesn't have that restriction? We've been trying to figure out, in the absence of, kind of express tax exemption laws, if you have any sense of how much power individual assessors have to take these kinds of affordability, restrictions into account.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I don't know. I probably don't know enough about that I should, but I don't really know how to answer that question. I think that's a really good question to talk to assessors. Some of the housing, like if you have a multifamily building, it's according to the building code, that's a commercial building. So that right off the bat is something different than a single family house. So I don't know. I don't know how to answer your question. I think that we'd have to do some more research into whether the town or the assessor has any ability to do anything about that. I don't know. I wish I did. Sorry.
We were just in it.
When we were building two-family houses, you and I were building two-family houses, they were not considered commercial properties for the assessor because they were attached housing, but they were in separate ownership. But by virtue of being attached, their assessed value was about 20 to 25% less than the same square footage freestanding. So that was one of the reasons that we wanted to attach the houses so that the maintenance, the tax burden and the operating burden were less. But the two houses were treated differently. I think once you hit 3 or 4, it moved into the category that you're describing.
Right.
Nothing to do about income. You had affordable, if you had some type of deed restriction on it, then I assume that might come into play.
Right.
It hadn't, the deed restriction hadn't come into play before, but Dee Dee's got Dee Dee Barrett has a bill right now that's talking about that affordability restriction. I don't know where it is in the legislature, but I know it's moving through the assembly.
It's still moving through, yeah, and that was the one, Habitat had sponsored that, so basically, it wouldn't assess the subsidized portion of a subsidized home. But when Brendan and I were down in White Plains, we went to a Case Law University Affordable Housing Summit. It's the link that Tim sent to us. An assessor spoke there, and they said specifically regarding ADUs, sometimes they assess ADUs at a lower rate than the garage because the value that garage provided to the homeowner actually exceeded the home ownership or the home unit portion of an
It's
ADU.
market value.
Especially the mother-in-law.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what kind of cars.
They add to the value or take away from the value, you know?
But that also had to do with parking in the area.
People look at it, right?
It had to do with whether there were parking limitations in the area or not.
Yeah.
So it's a complex equation.
Yeah, local assessors have a tremendous amount of power.
But your municipalities already give exemptions for veterans and for firefighters or whatever else, so all you do is qualify an exemption for it. Adopted by local law.
But
Well, the
those
state has to
exemptions
give you
are very
legislation in
small.
order to go through that.
Those exemptions.
Doesn't the legislation already exist in our home rule?
Not for the subsidized one. That's the one that's going through.
I mean, those things you talk about firefighters laws that are out there now, or senior exemptions, those are things that are, we have enabling statutes from the state.
Yeah, I think you have to have the authority to offer those reductions.
There was an article in the Register Star or the Columbia paper last week about how few firefighters actually take advantage of that program. So that might be something that just needs more marketing.
Well, they are trying to expand that right now, so.
So maybe
That's
it's
because they don't know.
I know
They
they
don't
don't
know about them,
But
that's
there's an
why.
important distinction because those exemptions are across 3 taxing jurisdictions. The county, the school district, and the municipality. Unless all 3 jurisdictions provide that tax exemption, it's cheaper to take the income tax deduction than it is to take the property tax deduction. So more firefighters have been going with the income tax deduction.
And
But
schools
Dee Dee has
are-
another bill right now in the assembly, which would allow firefighters to take both. Because what happens, many firefighters are like policemen, it's a family deal. The husband and the wife, both are firefighters, but you only get one exemption. So this would make it more equitable for them.
One thing that I neglected to mention in my slides is that another thing to think about is that can be related to zoning is when you have especially multifamily buildings being built for specifically to address affordability is to pay attention to energy efficiency and renewable energy in finding ways so that the building functions so that the people who live there, either buying it or renting it, have fewer monthly costs to maintain it for electricity and heat and things like that. So that's also often part of some of the housing tools that go into zoning is looking at energy efficiency and lead energy standards or other kinds of renewable energy type things to lower costs.
I'm very interested in the idea of thinking about comprehensive plans in a more regional, a more district-wide way, and specifically, I know your experience with Northeast, and we're talking about Northeast, Pine Plains, and Ankrum, for example, and the idea of, having a comprehensive plan that envisions senior housing in an area that doesn't have emergency service providers, to bring them to a hospital that is closing, because that whole area relies on Sharon Hospital for emergency services, and that hospital is fighting to close. So I'm,
I was born there.
yeah, it is.
No, but
Well,
but that goes to
they're
her-
fighting to not close it.
but that goes to her accessibility issue, right?
Exactly right. Yeah, I know, I'm sorry too. My sister just moved there. So my point is that, you know, that there's we often hear senior housing is at the high, you know, it's at the top of the list of towns, people in towns wanting senior housing. But I think it's just as important with a comprehensive plan to recognize the infrastructure beyond just public water and sewer. I mean, you know, if we don't have emergency service providers, if we don't have a hospital, then inviting a developer to come in, you know, to build senior housing in one town may not be as beneficial for the county as a whole as, you know, picking a town that has more accessibility. You know, towns in Columbia County that are closer to the hospital, towns in Columbia County that have, you know, more emergency service providers. And it's not a quick fix. You know, we're not going to be able to all of a sudden have many more volunteers for emergency services. We barely have enough volunteers for firefighters. So I think senior housing is something that should be almost part of like an overlay. I mean, I feel like we should have more of a countywide, district-wide overlay that identifies what's the most viable place for these different housing types.
Those are all excellent points. There's certainly nothing preventing multi-town or county-wide housing plans. I mean, Ulster County has a new housing program that it's not necessarily a zoning-oriented one, but it's setting up a system to promote housing. Multiple towns could develop a housing plan that coordinates those kinds of things together. I mean, that's, you know, overall, the big picture, that's really what smart growth is all about, is really looking at where we have opportunities for appropriate development and where we don't, and working together to make that happen. So yeah, that's certainly something that, you know, regional planning is often has a bad name in New York State, but it's really important.
I had a question about, so a lot of the tools like inclusionary zoning, incentive zoning, overlays, I feel like in a small town, it's on the municipality to have to do the implementation of like checking that those houses stay affordable, like do they have to, how involved do small towns have to be in the ongoing upkeep of certifying tenants, of checking incomes, because, you know, in a larger city, you have a board that would do that, or like if you, I understand if you took like a project-based voucher perhaps, or like a Section 8 voucher, then you'd already have that process happening. But if you're looking at maybe trying to create housing that's a little bit above the AMI levels of a voucher, how have you seen small towns successfully regulate and carry out those types of like inclusive or inclusionary zoning?
Well, there, you know, that is it's really important. There has to be an enforcement and administrative capacity. Some communities are looking at, like larger communities might have a housing authority. Smaller communities aren't eligible for that mechanism, but some communities are working with housing land trusts, or having their building departments. Yeah, there's got to be a mechanism. I mean, at the planning board level, the planning board, when they approve these things, they can make it a condition of approval that XYZ has to happen. What in the zoning would lay out the rules for all of those, you know, application of the AMI and eligibility and all that sort of thing. But there has to be follow through at the town or the village level. There has to be some mechanism and some entity that follows through and makes sure that those actually, it's just like any other condition of approval. There has to be a reason, you know, someone out there looking after that there's follow through on it. You know, it's the same thing with short-term rentals. There's all sorts of short-term rental regulations around, and then communities neglect to figure out the resources that are needed to follow up and inspect and make sure that those things actually happen. So that has to be built into that, the thought process that you just mentioned certainly is part of it. And another reason why collaboration with multiple communities makes that easier.
Yeah, we actually had that exact discussion at COPEC yesterday, exactly the question that you asked. And I think we were hoping that if the county decides to make this housing function an ongoing, permanent service function, that's one of the functions that maybe the county could play, is having someone spend some time on enforcement.
Yeah, it's definitely, and that's, a really good example of how many of our small communities don't have the capacity to handle that. And so that is something that needs to be figured out broader. I mean, I don't think there's a lot of pressure. We're not dealing with hundreds and hundreds of units in most of the small communities that I work with. But it, it has the potential for needing more follow through in administration.
I think. All right, I think we're good, man. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Well, thanks for inviting me, and good luck with the rest of your work. I've sent this PowerPoint over so you can distribute it as you need it, and let me know if there's anything else I can help you with.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very
Okay.
much, Nan.
Yep. Take care. Bye bye.
Yeah, that's great. Sorry.
We also have the PowerPoint presentation that she put together, September, that we went to.
Oh, terrific.
So we
Yeah,
will-
you guys could distribute that to everyone. That was, I know that was longer than this one, and it was really good.
It was went in detail on each of the areas that she addressed.
I just want to say, my town has worked with Nan on several projects, and the most recent one is she's done planning and zoning board training specific to our zoning laws as opposed to the more general ones that you see offered through other sources. And she's terrific at that. So, and she's also taken a list of questions in advance and prepared answers, in terms of, are there gaps here? Is this consistent with current law, that kind of thing, and incorporated that into the training. And I think we've seen attendance and training improve because it's more meaningful. So that's also part of this process, I think, is for the board, the boards to understand their role and to understand what they can do.
Okay, so that brings us to, we'll break to committees. Jump into the outreach committee. A few things are ongoing. So our Faces of Affordable Housing, which is actually the profiles of real people that either live and or work in the county. In some cases, work in the county, can't afford to live here yet. I collected 10 of those. A lot of these things are contingent on the website being updated. I'll get into that as we go through. The employer-employee survey, the draft version is done. It's been reviewed internally by our Vice President of Economic Development here in the office, Jessica Gabriel. Christopher Nardone now has it over at CGCC Workforce. Once he's done, we'll circulate it through the working groups here. Our website is being updated, so I've sent the outline for what our page will look like on the CEDC website, what links we want to have, what we want it to look like. That is what our website developer, who has told us in no uncertain terms, please stop editing the website while we're working on this. So just waiting for them to get done with their work. But once they're done, it's just plug and play. So once that's finished, we can start adding documents. And then soliciting comments for toolbox item priorities. I've heard directly from a few of the towns about who their point people are for housing. For the rest of the towns, we'll just continue to do the work that we're doing. And I think as we start to build momentum, we'll start to hear from more folks. Some of the towns I heard from just confirmed that either they themselves were the person that they want to be the point person, which makes the most sense for the supervisors at the table. There are a few that I'm still waiting on. I think they're trying to figure out who they actually want to decide is their point person.
If you want to update Ghent, I spoke with the supervisor of Ghent,
Yeah.
and not surprisingly, he appointed me.
Point of view, okay. And Michelle, I haven't heard from the mayor, but I'm just making an assumption. Okay. And one of our new appointees is in the room. Dave Hall from Ancrum is one of the co-chairs of the Ancrum Housing Task Force. Task Force Committee, you guys are a housing committee.
Yeah.
Housing committee. So Dave and, I forgot Bonnie. Bonnie Hunt, thank you, are the co-chairs of the housing committee. Dave was recently selected to join the task force. Dave is representing both Ancrum and the Columbia Green Board of Realtors, so sort of stepping up for Ron Kaplan. And we've also got somebody stepping into Kirk Neller's shoes as a representative from Columbia Memorial Health. That's going to be Brianna Scully. I think I pronounced that correctly. Brianna is not in the room? No. Brianna is the Vice President of Human Resources at Columbia Memorial, and based on the speech that Dr. Dorothy Herschel gave at the CEDC annual meeting, I think that is really what informed Brianna's appointment to the advisory board, task force. There was a real clear, distinct link made by Dr. Herschel between workforce development and housing at the CEDC meeting, so this kind of bridges both of those. Any questions on outreach?
So with the survey and that, will we be able to find out what folks want as far as housing goes?
From the employer survey?
Well, any kind of survey. Is there a resource to find, maybe people don't want to own houses anymore? You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I think there's a huge demand for rental as well. One of the things I do, just sort of, it's just a matter of course, it's something I do every week. I do an audit of what's out there, what's available. I actually just shared this with Michelle a little while ago. If you look at census data, which is where a lot of housing data is derived from, when you hear numbers, the average rental price in Columbia County is $990.
I don't believe that.
Well,
deny that.
right? So you look at that number and you say, well, that seems silly because I can't find an apartment for that much. But that's including everyone who's currently living in their units, right? So some of these are subsidized. Some of these are in units that they just don't pay rent. They might live in a relative's unit. So every once a week, I go through an audit what rentals are actually out there. From this week, I can tell you, and you use a few different sources, but it's about 38 rentals throughout the county total, not at a price point, just total. And these are apartments and townhomes and condos. I don't do houses because the houses are like $40,000. They really skew the numbers. So there are 38 total rentals in the county. 5 of them are not in Hudson. So most of them are in Hudson. The average rental is $2,100. And there are 12 rentals currently available in the county under $1,500. Variety of bedrooms.
12?
12 currently at $1,500 below throughout the entire county.
There's a new book that just came out on housing. It was reviewed this weekend on public radio, and they were talking about the tension between ownership. Because this housing task force was recommending ownership because that's the only way to build generational wealth. But the tension is that people aren't retaining their jobs where they used to have one job for life. Now you have a job every 5 years. And it's very difficult to be tied to a mortgage if you have to relocate. So that's another new tension.
Right, and that also goes back to the question of, when you talk about things like, doesn't necessarily need to be a community land trust, but when you talk about the resale formula restriction on homes, you sort of enter into that same kind of conversation. Well, they can't build as much equity, but you're not talking about building equity versus not building equity. You're talking about building equity versus you can't live here versus you just can't live here.
I think to Tim points, some people's lifestyle they want to move around and change. They don't want to be tied down to a weekend working on their home.
I know people that have owned homes fairly young, and after a few years, like, I'm never again. Not for everybody.
Certainly a full-time job.
But that's why we have to have a mix of both.
Mix of both.
Those toolkits?
The toolkit, they're already aggregated, so they just need to live on the website somewhere.
Oh, okay, so
which is what we're waiting for. I mean, they'll live there. Yeah, the initial thought was, and this is good catch up. The initial thought was that we would create these toolbox items, which is absurd because there are people like Dan out there who have already done it.
Sure.
So we're just going to aggregate them and have them. They'll live on the website, and we will also kind of shepherd towns towards the toolbox and vice versa.
Right. Chris, just going back to the topic of rental housing for a minute, when you look at the average rent or, kind of the rents that you're seeing that are available on the market, how do they compare with what HUD considers to be a fair market rent for its Section 8 purposes?
The fair market rent in Columbia County is $1,154 per 2 bedroom.
Wow, which is way less than
Might be
anything you see.
11.52.
at
No, it's
the-
11.52.
And
Actually,
as you go up
Uh-huh.
the bedroom number, it gets more disparate. So their one bedroom is somewhere around 980 or something like that. But by the time you get to a 4 bedroom, it's like $1,300 or $1,400. And 3 bedroom on my street, they're on for $3,000.
So what is the backlog for Section 8 vouchers now?
Yeah. Really? So it was like 200 like December 2021.
Was that high?
Yeah, at this point, it's really hard to tell because so many people like they can't find housing, so they lose the voucher and they have to wait a certain amount of time. And so it looks like 50 to 80, but
It's understated.
it's understated, and like we're in the process of trying to figure out what's going on right now. I've been talking to like Jeff Dodson, the housing authority. We're trying to get a sense of what.
Well, and the other measurement is the United Way nationally just came out with their updated Alice study, which
What
is
is that?
it's a compilation of what affordability really is in a community. And we can get that to you because it shows not only what housing costs are, but an array of costs that people who are going to live in a house have that they're not discretionary costs as part of their ability to live in a community.
Yes.
So one of my questions is actually going to be along those lines of, like, specifically Columbia County, like, are you guys having non-governmental organizations and other actors and stakeholders of your region to have a more like robust discussion of what could be done where and where the needs really are? Because I do want to back that sentiment that the Alice report by United Way just came out maybe 2 months ago, and it is a fantastic resource for this discussion.
We have looked at it, and we can get you the list of the participants because not only do we have the community engaged representatives, but we have representatives of 12 other organizations in the county as a resource group because we want to fill all the community seats with people whose day job it was to do housing. But we do have the opportunity to draw on their expertise and experience.
Yeah, Lisa.
I'm sorry that I'm not up to date in my brain on this. Where are the individual communities and their Airbnb, Verbo? Is there anyone being further aggressive in creating policy against the continuation?
I mean, Hudson is really known. Everyone seems to be waiting for the state level bill. So there's a short-term registration regulation bill that's circulating through the legislature. It probably won't be much this year. Right, I think we're.
So there's 8 more days.
Okay, so 8 days.
Okay.
It could be in the big ugly.
It would be interesting to know
In the
2 in the morning.
how many units,
I'm leaving here to go get it.
potential units being lost. You know,
Just the village spot, they're gonna try that again.
Lost.
Tried it before. and
They're gonna talk about
I don't know. If
Okay, all right.
Never.
I thought they brought it up for a vote, and it didn't get passed.
Yeah, so they're back
It's
talking.
hard
I mean,
to
that's great.
22 towns.
I mean, to compare that to what we need.
Yeah, but I don't think you
I
can.
don't know. We're gonna turn it to rental units though.
Right, I don't think.
No.
It's not a one-to-one.
No,
Yeah.
but
It's not a landlord.
I think it's an important,
No, but it's.
I think it's important.
It's a lot.
You hear that?
But that wouldn't address the issue of whether it's owner occupied.
Right.
Or just what more towns are concerned about, whether there's a residency requirement and or a time limit.
But if you're looking at physical space, right, if there are 700 short-term rentals that could be used for long-term, so you know, if you start, as a
That opens
metric,
up a huge number.
right, so if you're saying there's only 12 long-term rentals available, and we know there's 700, that are being short-term rentals. Just if you think about it as physical space, because we can only go vertical so quickly too. That's the other issue. It's nice to imagine that we're going to get a whole bunch of developers to come in and start building, but it's not going to happen. So I think to start to imagine how we can be more creative with the actual physical space we have.
That's the same question we have with second homeowners. I mean, how many people today own 2 or 3 homes?
Exactly
I mean,
right.
When we look at our population versus housing units, that quickly shows you that we have less people, but more housing units, and still a shortage.
I think 35% of the houses in my community are second homes.
Those does, but
I mean-
right, 65% of the.
I thought Copac
tax
is
bills.
the biggest, really. Copac is the biggest.
So,
Which again, it kind of.
did you say there are seven, is there a number now that we're talking about 700 short-term rentals?
That's fairly anecdotal. That's me doing my own audit of,
Zillow.
But it's important.
But some of those are not
It's
full
even
rentals
if-
either.
that's an
Some of
important
those are
metric.
1 bedrooms.
The metric that I am interested in is how many of those ever have been rentals or ever will be rentals? Because a fair number of short-term rentals are bedrooms within a.
That's what I'm saying. They're not really a
Those
full
are never
rental.
gonna become rentals. And also, I mean, if you look at the marketplace for short-term rentals, a lot of this stuff is kind of high-end, boutique. And I think those are not typically the people who want to be long-term rental landlords.
No, I'm just circling back to the idea that an ADU, is going to be the solution to change zoning to allow for more ADUs.
Yeah.
It's just as Nan said, you have to be very specific that, if you're going to build an ADU, it's going to be permitted or it's going to be allowed if it's going to be going then, to a certain income level, right? Workforce housing. But then you have to be sure you have somebody who can vent the renter, which we don't have. We don't have enough people to vent the renters for the housing that is out there. So everything has to be put on the table. I just think it's a huge problem.
Does that answer your question?
At the same time, Dennis,
We're confused about the whole thing and where we're headed, because as a home ownership, I mean, we talk about giving the town's a toolbox. All of a sudden, I go back to the town, I tell, fortunately, Nan's gonna be there to correct me, because she's doing our comprehensive plan. I go back with these grandiose plans, and she'll slap me around a little bit, Zoom-like. And I've done this before, and it's like, okay, so now we need to open up 1 acre parcels for the town of Boston, because we fight commercial things, right? Little bitty commercial things. I mean, that's what brings us out, because there's nothing else to do in the community, I guess. Go to the planning board meeting, and raise a fucking ruckus there. And so it's like, it's just crazy. But, I mean, and to say ADUs, we kind of allow it. We allow most anything in the town of Boston, because we don't enforce our laws that closely. But now you're also asking people to be landlords.
But that gets back to, and
I don't want, there are people who are just not skilled enough to become landlords.
The other thing is, ADUs are not going to be, they're going to be $50,000 to $75,000 to $100,000 to build.
Yeah.
absolutely,
Yeah.
And at 100,000,
Yeah.
it's 6% for 30 years, it's $600 a month.
Contractors are building, $350 to
Garages.
$500 a square foot, so an ADU is, a small one is 600 square feet.
one of my fears with ADUs, and this might be the tamest thing I've said about ADUs, because we're on record. Most towns have more ADUs than they know they have. And I think that if you start regulating them, and then you start having them to kind of go backwards, because you don't want to grandfather in all these ADUs. So few people take advantage of ADUs. When we were down in White Plains, a woman from, was it Croton on Hudson?
Yeah.
They were talking about a whole panel on ADUs. You had 5 people up there, and the woman from Croton on Hudson said they've had ADUs as of right now for 28 years, and they have 25. They know that they have more than they don't have, or that aren't registered. So my concern is that if you start to register them, some of the people that have off the books ADUs will stop using them as ADUs because they don't want to be regulated, and you won't get enough new people applying, and you will have a net loss of units.
So this is why I think the assessment policy can be really helpful. Because if somebody's going to get a tax break, or at least an assessment freeze or not be assessed on their ADU, they will have incentive to go like register with the assessor. Tell the assessor, I got an ADU,
Bring
here's
back
what
the
I'm charging
tacky
the rent.
star program,
And, right, because you get something for fessing up instead of a slap.
Right, but here, if you start fessing up, now you've got this ADU unit that's been grandfathered in, now all of a sudden you're registering it. Now we have to look at the septic. Okay, now you're talking $20,000-$30,000 because the existing septic
Isn't
on
really
the house,
compliant with
right,
today's laws.
isn't compliant
Yeah,
and what's to begin with.
The break doesn't comply.
And mound up our way, Brenda, correct me if I'm wrong, mound systems aren't cheap.
No.
You know, if you find gravel somewhere,
What are your towns that were
You're
doing?
like that, you're
Towns
like
like
that, like-
Florida and
yeah, we're going up. We are building up.
This is why I think to say zoning is the answer is not the
It's
answer.
one answer.
It's because what happens is,
Necessary but not sufficient.
what happens is people have that out in their comprehensive plan, that now has that in the books and they think problem solved. But it's not. The problem is so large that it has to be covered all at once. You know, we have to have it all understood, and it's not going to happen quickly. It has to be something that you understand is going to take 20 or 30 years to solve, you know. And I think that's my only concern about when we're talking about toolboxes, and the first thing toolbox says is change your zoning. And you actually think that's not the first place to go, in my opinion. I think that the reality is that we have towns that do not have an administration that can handle this. You know, each individual town just doesn't have the administration to handle it. We need something larger to handle it. And towns need a county effort or a district effort to handle it. That to me, I think, is essential.
No, I think, in housing, as in most difficult issues, there's never going to be just one or two things, like do these two things and you're done, right? So zoning is, one of those things. But, a lot of what Nan said, I hope nothing that she said sounded like it was out of left field, because we've talked about some of these things a number of times. Specifically if you're going to do ADUs, do short-term rental regulation at the same time. I banged that drum like crazy in the Berkshires. Take a look at your zoning, because your zoning is not the Constitution, contrary to popular belief that can and should change. Some of these zoning, and I understand that it's expensive to do zoning amendments, but some of these bylaws are 40 years old. So housing bylaws, not like conservation bylaws. Like, these are things that should change with time and have them reviewed. I do want to move on to policy, though. We're already after 5 o'clock. All right, so policy will be a quick one. Continue to collect examples of existing gentle density. So that was, again, one of the things that Nan talked about. You have these buildings in your neighborhoods. They're not scary, but they're somewhere between 4 to 10, in some cases 12 units. Even at Hillsdale, there's a 12-unit building in Hillsdale that I didn't know existed right off of 23. It's like just behind the grocery store.
Phil Geller written all over it.
It certainly does. It certainly
And then reasonably available.
Is it yellow?
It's yellow.
Oh, quel surprise.
So I'm just continuing to collect those, and they'll get those to the website when they're done. Assessing town and village housing timelines. So actually got, thanks to Rob Perry, I got a list of recent zoning amendments from all of the towns. It's good to know people in the county planning department. So that was a huge get. And then I know the pending ones are Chatham, Copic, and Lebanon, ones that I know offhand. But I think they're get
Pending for
zoning amendments after the comp plan. So they're usually tied together. And then sometimes we're just looking at zoning amendments alone currently. Okay, so this one will be a little bit tied to pre-development. I'm going to punt on this one, and we'll come back to it because that might be an even longer conversation than the AV one. So any questions on policy? Pre-development. This is again another audit of property. So one of the things that we were looking at was, are there single families out there that are vacant or distressed that could be turned into 2 families? It's one of the easiest ways to densify your stock, especially the gentle way. It's also something, the housing compact will be back. That is not done. That's going to keep coming back until some version of it passes or locals at office. Those are the 2 things that are going and if you convert vacant units, you get, I believe it's 1.5 credits for the amount of units that they want you to get to in your town. So that's still a viable path. So we're still getting our hands around how many of those are out there. All of the project specific, well, I shouldn't say all the project specific, but quite a few funding sources were announced in the past few weeks. CFACs and HCRs got their new programs out. The Affordable Housing Corporation has a new subsidy out. The most recent one was about $150,000 to $200,000 a unit. If you did basically like net zero climate buildings, that would be the subsidy per unit. The current one that's available now is $75,000 per unit, just flat, no matter what. Those used to be 40. They were 40 like 5 years ago. So they bumped up quite a
That's a
bit.
big, that is an enormous process. I mean, in terms of
It's
grant
a lot
writing
of red
and
line.
grant administration. I've done it. It's not for the faint of heart.
It's not as bad as the federal home loan
Yeah.
bank, but the federal home loan bank
I
application.
haven't done it. I'm just saying that that's
I went on
another
vacation.
area that would really benefit from regional or collaborative
Right.
efforts because of the administration required.
Chris, do you know if they're gonna come back out with another ADU subsidy program?
Like that, the 80+1 that they have.
That
So-
they did a very small model program
Yeah.
about a year ago, which we talked about, applying for Rojan and, didn't end up, but that could be a good countywide thing.
Yeah, and well, those programs tend to come back if they do well, and a lot of times they just come back if people actually apply. A lot of these programs just die in the vine because there aren't enough applications.
Or the money rolls over.
Or they're just.
Can we inquire and try to push them along at HCR? Could you give them a little,
I might come in.
You
for
right?
things like
HCR?
Well, we can, we can talk to people.
talk to our regional rural guy?
Well, I'll see a couple of people that will want to talk to on Monday, actually.
Are you, go ahead, jump in.
Yeah.
I was at, Jessica Gabriel and I were at the New York State Economic Development Council Conference, and Darren Scott, the Eastern Regional Director of Upstate Housing, gave this committee and Chris a great shout out. And said that Columbia County was at the top of the list of counties working on these issues in upstate New York. And prior to that, it wasn't totally resulting from that shout out. Bill Farber, who is the chair of the Board of Supervisors in Hamilton County and active in the Adirondack Association of Towns and Villages, asked Chris to come up and speak to them with Mike Borges from the Affordable Housing Coalition on Monday. And, that is a commitment when, just like, Nan did this for some marketing. We don't really market the Adirondacks, but we can learn a lot of new ideas that they might be looking at that might really be applicable to some of the smaller towns. And I do think that the more visibility we get, don't want it to distract from the focus of getting things done. But it was a real testament to the effort that all of you are putting into this and all the work that's being done and the support of the Board of Supervisors in making this happen. I think you want to, point that out and give Chris some positive feedback. It's good enough to get from the people you work with, but when the head of the programs at the state, that $1.85 will get you half a cup of coffee. It is good feedback.
Yeah, the next step is read my white paper.
What?
The next step is read my white paper.
Yeah. And I think they also are included in that concept is, when they talk about the county wide, is the great work that has been going on in the city of Hudson since Michelle came. Is that over a year now, a year and a half?
2 years.
2 years. And so I think that, but I think the numbers that are most shocking to me that you shared today, Chris, were the 20 plus available rentals, or 30 plus, and only 4 of them or 5 of them are out.
Yeah.
Are not in the city.
Yeah, and it's, the availability thing is huge. So when we were in Philmont for the groundbreaking, that good is what are the village trustee? She's the village trustee in Philmont. She said 60% of the homes in Philmont, or 60% of residents, are renters, but there are no apartments available right now in Philmont. So you've got to, it's not a huge village, but that's still, you've got 60% of your units are rentals and not a single one is available right now.
And there was a developer who was looking to do some affordable housing in the old mill building in Philmont, and he was encouraged not to.
Why? That would be a front.
Yeah.
Spoke to their own
I'd have to say something that's probably inappropriate.
Okay,
I thought
so
they had serious structural issues with that building.
But this guy's, you know,
Yeah,
I just wanted to circle back to what
he's
Dan
gonna
said.
build a event space there, so. He wants
Okay.
money. Okay.
Based on your statistic of 60% being renters. So though that, and no rentals available, that's a way of looking at the status quo. We're a community with we're a county community of declining population. And so we're not only talking about staying even, we're also hopefully talking about a plan or an opportunity to bring more people here because of housing. So I think that we want to make sure that we don't lose sight of future plans.
Yeah.
We lost another 1,000 people in the census update this year. So we're down to 60,000 people now. So and that trickles all the way through school districts, fire companies, everything. So we really need to think about not only about serving the people we have, but how to attract more people.
Well, and that brings me to a question that I asked Mike, which is if somebody was, and it sounds like there are people very serious about getting some senior housing, putting it together, how certain would we be that a significant portion of that would be taken up by Columbia County residents who would downsize? Do we have marketing on that? Is that just something we would guess at? Because, you know, if we're talking about trying to put housing online for people to buy, it seems to me, and we all know we're aging, you know, I don't know that it's logical that they would. And
Can we
does
get some
anybody
trending?
have
Can
a,
we get some trending from other communities?
I think what we looked at, that was the project that Amador Construction wanted to build after they decided not to build the 700 units at the corner of 98 and 66. And what they're proposing was similar to what Northeast Health had developed in Slingerlands, the Beverwick, or up in Queensbury, Highland Meadows. And it's it's an 80 unit to 100 unit senior complex for high-end people. You put up $200,000 a year, or you put up $200,000 when you move in, you pay $2,500 a month, you get country club atmosphere and one meal a day in a hotel dining room. And when you leave, for whatever reason, you get your money back. So with, you know, when interest rates were higher, what they were doing was they were using on the interest to subsidize the operation. We spent a lot of time here at CEDC with, the only way that would work is if St. Peter's Healthcare agreed to operate. And I think that it was right at the time that Albany Met was closing their deal with Columbia Memorial. And I think that, frankly, what the market was, they felt it would work because they felt that second homeowners who ended up retiring here would probably be the highest and best population because of the cost factor. Or legacy, long-term Columbia County business owners or professionals who might have a place somewhere else, you know, either in Maine in the summer or Florida in winter type of thing. And so they put it off, but I know Amador is still interested in doing it. So again, it's that whole continuum. You know, you need so many units for the lowest of income, and you have units for the highest income. But I think what you saw when they mental health built the units out in Greenport, that people who went there freed up housing in other places. So it's not, it is a path to get open units.
well, that's what I'm saying. I'm not sure that it's there. I'm asking
I think
the
it'll open,
question.
I think it'll open units, but I don't know if it's gonna open affordable.
well, that's it.
Because if I look at the people in my community that would be eligible for the kind of program you described, you know, they're in 5 to $1 million to 500,000 to 1.2 million.
And they're gonna
houses.
sell
Those
it
are
so they
never
can
gonna
afford to live it.
Exactly.
Right,
And they're-
right.
So it's not gonna.
Right.
It's like living
I
plus.
think you bring up an important issue, which is market absorption.
Right.
Right, and Brenda can tell you that, you know, in some towns, it was hard to sell a single unit because there wasn't qualifying families in that town to buy a unit, right? So market absorption. The other thing is displacement, because you're not necessarily providing workforce housing for the people that are here, that are working, You're sometimes bringing in people that from other places to come here because it'll be more affordable.
Right.
And then hope they work.
And hope they work. So, I mean, I think that again, what it circles back to me is that you need to have, a kind of agency, that is going to look at this and continue to look at it over the long term, so that everything is a case study, and it then turns back and educates the next case study. So you're constantly looking. Every time you do a project, you can then do the metrics. I mean, evidence-based solutions are the best ones. So who moved into the 2 units. How many people actually freed up the next housing. And we don't have many case studies behind us, which could be a good thing because there are not too many to look at. I mean, we have a few Columbia County Habitat for Humanity projects, and we have. I think it's important that we look at what has been successful and figure out what actually happened with those families. Where did they come from? Do they actually, were they local families? Do they live and work here? Do they go they drive close to their office? To me, I think.
And it does loop us back to looking at various pockets of market share. And then at the same time, looking at how we can ensure that people know that there's resources available to upgrade and do restoration and renovation and repair of homes that are deteriorating.
So may I put you on the spot? What, you're midway through a displacement grant somewhere in that time frame. What have you learned about displacement in
Well,
terms of?
Anti-displacement grant.
Yeah.
Okay, so have seen a lot of displacement, but so a lot of folks have moved to like Rensselaer County or Albany County, or also just out of the region totally to like go down south to like the Carolinas and Texas. And so like the way we've seen that is both in terms of like anecdotal, like people saying actually like my sister's moved or like these people have moved, and then also in terms of looking at the census numbers or like income levels, and we've seen like a decrease specifically in the Black population in Hudson.
Are they still working here? Are they moving to Rensselaer and then commuting, or are they just completely gone?
A lot of them just left to relocated totally. And then I've also seen a lot of people who are not displaced, but they're unable to save money and are like one easy way of being in debt because their rent has gone up so much. And then I've also seen families who are like doubled up. So they moved in with a sister, we've seen a lot of families that are multiple families living in one house. So that's what we've seen.
So the employer survey, to Tim's point earlier, if it's constructed properly, should help us flesh out that picture.
If you have employers, but much of the county people do not work for employers.
We've also seen a lot of like younger professionals who moved outside of
It's the nature of the economy.
Yeah, they don't work for people.
Get paid.
I wonder if you could reach out to like a Campbell, we've got Campbell Village up our way, I know it's pretty full, I think there's a wait list there. You've got the place behind with the NICEAG building, I think that's senior housing, that's relatively full. Do a survey to these individual places. I know of at least 5 folks who did downsize, just exactly what you said, where they got old and said, you know what, screw the lawn lawn. I'm gonna watch it get mowed.
That's been the attraction too. We've got a mobile home park expansion going on inside us, and they've only added 20 homes in a number of years. They've got 5 more there, but you can't get electricity because the national grid so far behind. But that's another story. But what I've seen there is we have had some local folks that have sold their existing home and moved there for just retirement purposes. It's marketed as 55 and older, but then those homes become sold to somebody from out of town. So to your question, Bob, providing that type of housing has kept some of those people here, which is important. So we've got some local folks that grew up here, raised a family here, and now they want to stay in the area, so they've moved into a more affordable home.
Well, certainly want to keep them here. 100%, and want to keep them out of long-term care 100%. And the question is, does it open up? Are we driving the market that way?
Right.
That's what we're trying. How do you drive the market?
Or
so they're not 900.
Or leverage that.
That is that families, the senior family members you're selling to younger family members, so that the younger family members can look after the older seniors.
Yeah, but
Well,
also.
that's not as bad.
No, but it is another path.
It is enough, but at least it's younger ownership.
But also maybe capture some of that resource. So for example, if you do build senior housing where people then sell their house to move into that, capture some money from that. You know, like a community preservation fund. If we cannot if we cannot use the money from a community preservation fund for affordable housing, maybe we figure out how we can. Because that's the thing, we have high housing turnover. So as a community, we should be able to capture some of that. You know, we should be able to say, look, 2% over the median income, median price point of the house, so that we can then keep the rural workforce that you need because you're moving in here to a home. I think that I think is essential for us to get revenue. We just don't have the revenue. So we do not have hotels, we do not have manufacturing units, manufacturing companies. We don't have any revenue. So at least we should be able to capture some of the flipping of these homes, and so that those towns can have some money to work to keep the people that they need to service those people.
Well, Chris, you actually did that spreadsheet that you sent around.
For informational purposes only.
For informational purposes only, and I think you figured, was it calendar year 2021?
Tim sent me updated numbers directly from
That over at the county.
yeah.
Real property,
So I plugged those in. That was just 2022.
whatever the date was, yeah.
It
that
was just
that
2022.
complete.
And
It came out once you applied
what was the percentage you applied?
the
So
0.004, right?
0.04?
0.004. But it's not 4%, it's actually.
It's 0.04, yeah.
It came out to, so just for 2022, it came out to just over $410,000. Which doesn't sound like a lot because that's one unit, right? But it could be 16 different $25,000 subsidies that you combine with the $75,000 subsidy from AHC.
Yeah.
Now you've got a $100,000 subsidy, you got a $300,000 bill, you can sell for 200, it's flat. But you only got 16 units. So, it's a piece of the puzzle.
So is there a way, and we were talking about to find any trending. 10 years ago, I had numbers or data, and I can't remember what the source was, that said that when people retired here, they were generally here for 10 to 15 years until they needed more medical services or that kind of thing. Because that starts to talk to your point about how quickly those houses turn over. They buy at 65 or 60, and then at 80, they're gone. So I'm just wondering how many houses fall into that category.
And when you're talking about a little revenue over 15 years, it's a huge revenue. That
On an annual basis, yeah.
it's because that is money for the next generation to solve this problem. I really don't think it's going to be solved by this generation. It's going to have to take many generations to solve it, but they have to have money to do that. And I think it's personally, I think that we provide the state with a lot of resources by saying rural, right? So I think it's quite reasonable for us to say we need money for the rural workforce that sustains our rural communities. And we can't find a way to get it from the state. We should have a way to get it from people that are coming in and buying homes at a higher rate.
No,
What was your cutoff to calculate that?
405.
No, but it's not more than 5,000.
I go, just to tax people for the sake of taxing people. So.
Come on, libertarian.
It's not.
I'm just, you know what I mean? You just said, now, we haven't even gone here yet, 73 jobs out of here. And what are we as a county doing to attract them? We're never gonna attract people. Wait, listen just for a second.
Yep.
3% unemployment rate, it's terrible.
Yeah.
If you're looking for employees, it stinks.
But to be clear, this is not a tax. This is a fee that goes on to houses
It's a
above a certain
It's a
price point.
tax. And what
No, it would be above a price point. So you're talking about people that are coming in to buying a home that is above a price point that any workforce family would not have to pay a penny. They would not have to pay a penny.
It's still, it's a
Well,
tax.
it's like New York State's mansion tax.
It's a tax.
Well, and the good news, I just got off the phone with the CFO at Flanders, and
Is this the
Illinois.
73 jobs you're talking about?
Because there is two companies interested in buying the building.
That's good to
But
hear.
the problem is it's on a long-term lease that expires in 2032.
Can't you sell the value of the lease?
Yeah, well,
Right.
But I mean, there's not enough decent job. I mean, I mean, I grew up, got married, and bought a house, and then we worked 2 or 3 different things. I'm mowing lawns till 9 o'clock at night, for God's sakes. But yet the people, it's sound like an old fogey, for God's sakes. People don't want to do that as much anymore. They want to rent or they want to enjoy life.
Want a
God
career,
bless
40 hours a week.
Well,
I
it's
don't
just,
think this is-
but I mean, what we should look at is not, this 405,000 is like, to me, it's like an arbitrary figure.
It's the median home.
And it will change year to year.
It will
But
change.
why not, if you look at those numbers, there's a big disparity between the upper, like in Austria, I'm looking at quickly.
Some of those big ones, yeah.
Yeah, we've got a $2 million one that's sold, a couple $1 million ones, and then there's some lower ones. But, you've got a place in the middle. You don't have to go to this because the average person selling for 405,000 is me. And I can't afford to be.
You wouldn't pay it.
You wouldn't pay that.
That's what, so you wouldn't pay that until you're paying something.
Right, so this won't change your mind, but so in Columbia County, how much does it cost?
He's a hell of an arguer. Are you gonna use that when you're?
It won't change your mind. It's something that
You wouldn't,
Mike, what is the average cost to send a kid to school in Columbia County for 1 year?
$15,000.
$15,000, so they go for 13 years, right? So you've just given that kid $165,000.
Well, I live in
There's no guarantee that kid stays in the
Hudson,
county.
it's
when they're done with it.
$35,000
It's a lot more than
I left-
$15,000.
I lived in a town where they put a moratorium on single-family homes because they didn't want anyone more, because
No more kids.
the amount of taxes from even a $500,000 home was, to the school district was like $18,000. And it was just covering the cost of the kid.
We saw that in Maine. There's communities that don't allow anybody to stay over the winter because they don't want families moving in and sending kids to the system. They're happy to, have your tourism dollars during season, but come October 1st.
Bring your water.
But not come October 1st, everybody has to vacate.
But, that also assumes, I think, that the school districts are at capacity. Our schools are, 40% occupied? We were built for the schools were built for much larger populations. I can tell you, my son's been out of school for 6 years now, but the cost per pupil in New Lebanon was more expensive than to send him to a private school in Berkshire County.
But I just,
And so there are all of these factors that are considered, but 6 years ago, it was closer to $20,000 a pupil in New Lebanon than 15. So
I guess what I'm getting at, this is very like sophomore year of college. We just got done with an economics class, and now we're back to building and chopping it up, right? But the idea behind taxing homes or property for kids to go to school is that we decided as a society that we place a value on an educated populace, right? But your subsidy goes with the kid. It doesn't stay in your community. For things like this idea of, adding this one-time fee to the people who are selling their homes, right? So they're already making money, so they pay like $200 or whatever to the buyer, to the seller.
So,
Yeah, so you pay the seller pays the fee, and that subsidy is staying in your community because it's subsidizing local homes. And it doesn't have to be homeownership, it can be rental, and sometimes it can just be land acquisition.
And my numbers are totally off. Rob is right. It was last year, the city of Hudson was 30,000.
It's 35 this year.
Yeah.
1,569 students, 54.5 million.
when we're graduating, 175, 200 kids for the whole county a year. That's what we're graduating.
well, that's the
And the state
issue,
has just
right?
raised
All
taxes
these,
to get
all
more
these
money,
things
and
bleed into
They still
one
raise our
Right.
tax system, so.
And our task, I know, touches all of those.
I mean, I.
But the fact, and the thing is, when these houses burn in 10 years, who's gonna put that out? When none of the kids, because none of the older folks. So I guess, how do you push the market is what we're asking. How do you push that market? If they don't, all senior projects don't have to be like that.
No,
Could there be another senior project
then you
that's
need to
not?
near the
like
hospital
that?
or
Well,
I just
we
wanna-
could talk about that. We actually do have good EMS.
yeah,
In the county.
exactly.
We have
In,
lots of it.
but in certain towns.
Well, and it's out there though. I mean, we could get them
No, but
to.
there's another piece
If
to
the state
that.
would allow us to do it countywide, we'd be better off.
How many MS strips are bogus?
I just wanted,
Yeah.
Lisa's having a hand up.
Oh, sure, sorry.
That's okay. I just wanted to, I have two things. One, so for a year, I looked to buy a house, and the commissioner knows my journey. A saga, so, Chris. So for a year, and I was executive director for Cornell Property Extension, and in that year, I'll be there a year next week, I have lost about 5 employees out of my 35 because they couldn't afford it. And so one of the things that they've always asked me, as we drive around and look at ag land and bunch of things, is what's happening with all of these properties that are quote unquote ghosted or are, the word is ghost, or that they're abandoned. Like, do we have true inventory on where the status is on all of these properties? Because you do see a lot of properties that look like no one's living in them. And I know those are very complex things, but a lot of that's what a lot of, the younger staff are like, we want to buy them if it's about. I'm like, yeah.
Yeah.
But I guess maybe, can that help in some way to get clarity on what that true inventory is, so that if there are people who are not coming, maybe there's, my dad bought a house here, he's been up here since 1969. In 1979, for $4,000, he bought a shack in Gallatin, and we all thought he was crazy, and now it's probably worth $600,000. And plumbing and electric, all that, but initially it was really. But back then, we
Windows,
did that.
doors, the crazy guy.
He was 29, right?
What up?
So.
Let's go, we can't.
That's the camp.
Futuristic
But
world.
my point is, the younger people who are interested to live rurally, like we are, that don't want to see us all spread out and sprawl developed, but that these are, the whole reason I've always loved, coming here for half of my life, of course, is because of that. So what about the buildings that are, how do we get a good inventory on which ones might be able to be auctioned, which ones, because when I was looking for a house, I said, oh, I saw a couple that were auctioned, like, do you got cash? And I'm like, you got that kind of cash. So I just wonder, like, what inventory could we do to find out, and how would that be? Because I believe I'm gonna give you a number, that there's 500 houses in Columbia County that are completely abandoned. At some level, and just as a guesstimate.
So I think the ones in a big city, they put the circle with the X on it.
Yeah, but I'm.
Hang on, to clear that up real quick, that means if there's a fire inside the building, you can't go inside.
Right.
Sorry, that just like triggered me, went back to my Troy Bacon building.
Don't go in.
It doesn't mean it's gonna get demolished, because all the ones on Route 9 that got redeveloped, those all had those right
They
outside.
did.
Right.
And now they're all beautiful. Wow, there's
Well,
three left to
we
do,
have
but
been
they're mostly
talking,
beautiful.
we have been
Oh,
talking
you
to
don't-
the county, with respect to foreclosures, and last Thursday, the Supreme Court, ruled that to the extent that, there's a property that's worth $100,000 and there's $20,000 of, foreclosed taxes, if the community sells it for $50,000, they gotta give the owner the $30,000 back.
Or find a debtor that might be,
Yeah, so there's gonna be some change in the availability of those properties.
Yeah, but you get to deduct an administration fees.
Oh, yeah.
but there are other people that are just sitting on
And
houses that, are neglected, and they just sit there and they're not being foreclosed on.
Right.
I'll tell you, the reverse mortgage world has ruined more houses like that in my mind in our town. I mean, people that went and got a reverse mortgage, maybe it worked for that individual because it let them stay in their home. But then it's bad for the property, because then the family ends up with this huge debt, nobody wants it.
Every time I see Henry Winkler on TV selling reverse mortgages, I call it a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah, right.
But what about the other guy, Dan Selleck, right?
Oh, so,
Tom
yeah.
Selleck.
Tom Selleck sells them too.
I just have one question about the tax we were speaking of a few moments ago. It was my understanding as a realtor on the buyer end of the house in Tivoli, which is it was the buyer there.
It transfers over.
Just leave that door open.
It's like a conveyance.
Somebody's gonna pay.
So, yeah, it gets paid. I mean, it's listed like that's how it pays it, but it transfers over and it ends up, once you get done with the closing, it ends up coming to the buyer.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Because, I just wanted to
Raise
say,
more money,
I have
sell this
limited
help or a brother.
experience with this, but Tivoli has, Red Hook town tax as well as Tivoli village tax, and on top of that is this surcharge for houses that are both median income. Everybody wants to live in Tivoli, there are price wars there, and I know I represented a buyer of somewhat modest means, and the house needed some work, so it wasn't a lot of money. They did not blink an eye about paying that extra little bit. It didn't seem a deterrent at all, because you're spending so much in closing anyway. It didn't turn out to be a lot of money. this house is not
fair?
a lot.
150% of your mortgage.
But, so I don't know, that's limited experience and it's anecdotal, but it seems to me that.
Well, it happens all over. If you go to, island communities, they have an assessment that goes to the conservation easement. I mean, it's,
Yeah, and I think if it's not just for conserving open spaces, but it's also.
Well, that's what has to be changed.
Yeah.
That would have to be changed.
I would think would be attractive.
well, and one of the things we did discuss on the open space thing was, to the extent someone gives you a 50,000 or a 50-acre parcel, take the first 2 acres off the front of the
Right.
road frontage
Right.
and create a buffer and use the 40 acres behind it for
Conservation.
Right, but Albany would have to change.
I mean, this
You can
exists
negotiate
in
the building
Massachusetts.
envelope
This is the thing that exists right across the border. Great Barrington pulls in over
Well, we should
$1.5
just
million
supplement
a year just off of that program.
So I just want to circle back to Lisa's question, which is how to inventory those houses. So we're working on tax defaults, right? Or tax auctions. You've already provided an inventory of municipal or county-owned land in each community. Not much. But I think each community then is driving the roads in their community and looking at those properties, trying to find out who owns those properties, what the status of those properties is, and whether or not those properties can be put to use. So I do think it's happening on the ground in small communities.
I think we should deploy all the realtors because they'll get a 60-second commission.
We are looking at a number of old farmhouses that are just sitting there, and our housing committee's been talking about that.
Did you send that in?
How can we rehab them?
Yes.
No, there's like 9 properties on it, like.
We can send it.
So just so, oh, that's it.
County.
County-owned
And town.
Yes. Anytime you change the tenant, they hate gathering.
So, real quick before we go, just because, and this is actually great context for this. So I think I've spoken to a few of the committees about potentially changing the schedule of meetings, right? I'm okay with, I'm still okay with doing monthly meetings, but what if we just did a presenter every other month? And then all at once,
We would
is
go
a
over.
broader conversation like this.
I think that's.
And then we
very
maybe
important.
focus on like one idea per committee or just like one idea for that. And those don't necessarily need to be hybrid meetings. Those can just be us meeting like this.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll shoot around like good.
But hybrid might be
Before
an
we-
interesting case.
Before we
Well, not public.
Not public, just hybrid first.
Yeah.
Chris, before we end, there was reference to the hours report. Do you have that?
I can send it to you.
Can you send
I'll
it to
send
us?
it to
Yeah,
you.
great.
And also
I can send it
Dan's
to you.